Presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden spoke today about the unrest that is sweeping across the country. He spoke in Philadelphia. He condemned police brutality, but he was also critical of President Trump's response to the unrest. Here's what he had to say.
Leadership that can unite us, leadership that brings us together, leadership that can recognize pain and deep grief of communities that have had a knee on their neck for a long time. Donald Trump isn't interested in doing that work. Instead, he's preening and sweeping away all the guardrails that have long protected our democracy, guardrails that have helped make possible this nation's path to a more perfect union, a union that constantly requires reform and rededication. And yes, the protest from voices that are mistreated, ignored, left out, or left behind.
Biden went on to say that President Trump appears more interested in serving the passions of his base rather than addressing the needs of the people in his care. We want to bring in Ed O'Keefe and Caitlin Huey-Burns to talk a little bit more about this. I got to say, guys, and I don't know about you, Vlad, I had actually been wondering why we weren't hearing more from Joe Biden during this whole thing. I understand that it's challenging because, the campaigning is not typical because of COVID-19. And we can see that Biden is actually in Philadelphia today. And so he's traveled a little bit to do this. But you know what, Ed, I'm going to start with you and then we'll go to Caitlin. Ed, kind of like your overriding sort of feeling about what Biden said and the message he was trying to get across.
Sure. Well, look, he spoke there from Philadelphia City Hall in the middle of a city that is among those, of course, that has seen some incredible unrest in recent days. This was a hastily arranged address. The networks got word of it late last night, saying that he would be making remarks not only about the general unrest, but then, of course, what the president had done just last night there at the White House and in Lafayette Park. He began by speaking the words, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." George Floyd's last words, but they didn't die with him, Biden said. They're still being heard, echoing across this nation. I can't breathe. It's a wake-up call for our nation, for all of us. Important to point out, this is his first trip outside of his home state of Delaware since March 12th, when he emerged briefly in Wilmington to make some remarks. He was in Wilmington last week for a Memorial Day event, and yesterday, Anne-Marie, yesterday morning, he met with civil rights and religious leaders there in his hometown of Wilmington for about 90 minutes, 2 hours, to talk about what was going on, and then did a virtual roundtable in the afternoon with some mayors, the mayors of Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, and St. Paul, Minnesota. To your point about where's he been, that's a bit of a chicken and an egg issue. Certainly the campaign hasn't been putting him out as much as some supporters would like, but yet when he does do these appearances virtually, they're not necessarily being covered. And there's some tension, some frustration there among Biden aides and allies about that. But I think today's address and the effort they made overnight to make sure that people would pay attention to this is a signal that he is preparing to reemerge. Candidly, to throw up the fourth wall of coverage, for example, the television networks have finally agreed to establish a protective TV pool because they're now being told by Biden aides that he is going to be speaking out and traveling out a little more often. He would call Philadelphia a suburb of his native Wilmington, but so it's not that far for him to go, but it is notable that he went there. Of course, Philadelphia, where you are, Anne-Marie, is also the headquarters of the Biden campaign, so it's a place he's likely to return to many times to make these kinds of remarks. But also got to remember, he's speaking out on an issue of race and inequity in this country only about 10 days after he got in real hot water for saying some impolitic things on The Breakfast Club, the influential radio show, where he suggested that black voters who were trying to decide between him and the president, quote, ain't black. He had to very quickly clean that up. And he addressed that yesterday in that meeting with civil rights leaders. But today also very clearly designed to remind Americans, I'm not Donald Trump, he said. I'm going to try to do things differently should I be president. And that is an argument you'll continue to hear. The empathy that he talks about today, the style of leadership he would provide, are two strong contrasts that the Biden team believe can help him win the White House in November.
Caitlin, I was struck by some of the words that the vice president used in comparing and contrasting the president of the United States and how he would govern should he be elected president. He used words repeatedly, united. I wrote some of these down, together. He also called out some of the president's divisive language, including the looting and the shooting. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, which he compared to a racist Miami police chief. He referenced Bull Connor. I urge our younger viewers of CBSN to look up who Bull Connor was and why the president's use of the language of dogs would bring back some horrific memories for African Americans in this country. And so by delivering this speech, and I noted to Anne-Marie that he delivered this speech in Philadelphia much in the same way that candidate Obama did in 2008 when there were criticisms of him with regards to his associations with Jeremiah Wright, which for a lot of people signaled a turning point in the candidacy of Barack Obama. It was not lost on me the imagery that we saw here of the American flags and the vice president, the former vice president, was something that we haven't seen in quite some time from it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. I was actually going through that speech from Obama earlier this morning. That was 12 years ago in March in that same city. And the backdrops, as you noted, were very similar with American flags behind them. Biden certainly wanted to draw this contrast with Trump, especially given the visuals that we saw last night. Ed mentioned that he had gone, Biden did, to meet with community leaders in Wilmington. And in that setting, in the church that he visited, he used that opportunity to say that he wanted to listen. Today and yesterday, we heard from the supporters of him even saying that, look, one state senator said, we love you, but we also want to push you. They told him yesterday that people have talked about programs and policies for a very long time, and there hasn't been many deliverables on that. So he was kind of listening to that yesterday, and then today giving this speech in which he says he's going to give more of these kinds of speeches as the campaign goes on. Today he did say that action needs to be taken now, that he has talked about what he would do in his first 100 days of president if elected, but he also pushed Congress to act right now. For example, he pushed them to act on a bill that had been introduced in 2015 by Hakeem Jeffries, the congressman from New York, which would outlaw the chokehold, the use of the chokehold by police force under civil rights law. He pushed for that to be moved on quickly. And so that's what I'm going to be kind of looking for in the next few days, how Biden is communicating with lawmakers. But this was certainly an attempt to be presidential, to show a contrast with the current president. And I think, to Ed's point, Biden is able to use his own experiences with grief to relate to voters and potential constituents. And I think while he has been kind of relegated to his house over the course of the past few months of this campaign due to the pandemic, those kinds of things are really difficult to translate virtually and online. And so I think now that you're seeing him kind of give this speech referencing, of course, Memorial Day, but also over the weekend was the 5th anniversary of his son's passing, he kind of uses his own personal grief to speak to people. We know that he talked to the family of George Floyd, for example. And so those are the kinds of things that as we start to see Biden maybe out and about more, that he will really kind of use to relate to people, or try to.
Caitlin, I think that's a really good observation. When it comes to campaigning, sort of Biden's strong suit, certainly what he considers his strong suit is his ability to sort of get down on the ground and, touch people. He's a hugger and all that sort of stuff, and certainly that's gotten him into a little bit of trouble. But that is sort of physically connecting with people is something that he considers his strong suit, retail politics. But you can't do that in this time. And the speech, I actually sort of found a little subdued, and you guys can disagree with me. I welcome disagreement, but it sort of sounded a little subdued to me. And I wonder if within the campaign there is a concern about him becoming I don't know, maybe a little too loose with his words, as we know. Ed noted that he got into a little bit of trouble before, and a desire to sort of like limit his expressiveness in a way.
I think there's a few things that works there, Anne-Marie. I think when he's in a crowd, a typical pre-pandemic crowd, let's put it that way. You're right. He could be a little more schmaltzy, a little more flippant with his words. That's just his style. For this kind of an address, and there have been a few of them over the course of his campaign, where he stands in front of flags, wears a red, white, or blue tie, and appears to try to be presidential. He did it last summer when he called for the impeachment of the president. He did it earlier this year in talking about the initial response to the pandemic and the coming troubles. He did it today. He's done it a few times. It's designed to make him look like a commander-in-chief, to sort of put him in voters' minds, in the Oval Office or in command of everything. He strikes a far more sober, serious tone. But if he's out on the stump, if he's meeting with people, if he's getting ice cream, he can turn that on, that charm that you talk about there. And I think they understood today you got to demonstrate some sobriety and some seriousness. And have there been attempts to rein in what he's saying? Yes. By limiting his exposure at all, they're doing that, the idea that there's no harm being done. And sure enough, he goes out and does that interview, that 23-minute interview on The Breakfast Club, and in the final 17 seconds or so, said what he said and created a real headache for himself. His team knew it was self-imposed. It was their own of their own making, and they've, it's probably been a reminder to him at least that he has to be very careful when and how he's engaging people. And certainly right now, given the real concern and outrage with what the president did last night, he's got to provide a very strong and sober contrast with that, should he be trying to win over people who are concerned about what's been going on.
Mm-hmm. All right, Ed O'Keefe,
and
Caitlin Huey-Burns.
just to pick up on that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Caitlin. Mm-hmm.
Just to pick up on that point really quickly, in our CBS News polling that was introduced today, about half of Americans disapprove of how Trump is handling this new crisis, but about a plurality of voters say that they hadn't heard enough from Biden to know yet. And so I think that's kind of what the task ahead is for the presumptive Democratic nominee in the coming days and weeks, is to present himself in this way. And he says that he wants to do it by listening and giving these speeches, but there is certainly a segment of the population, an important segment, that is waiting to render judgments until they hear more.
Interesting
and Anne-Marie,
stuff.
real quick, I know we have to go.
Yes.
Real quick, I should have mentioned this sooner. You would have heard him in the speech there talk about expanding access to health care and making sure that the country can get to universal health care. You might think to yourself, why on earth would he do that right now? Remember, beyond the apparent and immediate issues in front of us, health care remains a huge concern to voters in this country. And the way he talked about it there, about how it speaks to the inequities in the country and how it sort of insults the being of the first responders, the medical first responders who've been dealing with the pandemic, that is a theme that not only he will return to until November, but perhaps more critically, down-ballot congressional, House and Senate Democratic candidates will continue to bring up. You will see that, ladies and gentlemen, at home, in the mail you get, in the ads you see, in the radio interviews those candidates do, because Democrats understand it remains a real top-of-mind concern. And it's actually kind of skillful of him to bring that up here today in this setting, because they know it's an underlying concern for so many.
See, that's why I love talking to Ed and Caitlin Huey-Burns. They explain the surface and then the many, many layers underneath. Thank you so much, guys.